Hello, bonjour, Quay, Udlakot, Tonshi. I'm Carolyn Bennett, and thank you for joining us. I'm joining you today from my home in Toronto on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, where we acknowledge all the Indigenous peoples who paddled these waters and whose moccasins walked these lands. And I'd like to recognize the traditional territories from where you are all watching today. I'm so happy and excited to have you join us for a conversation with the truly inspiring Shilawat Klutje, a shiro of mine for a very, very long time. Today's discussion is part of the Indigenous Reads annual December holiday campaign. Indigenous Reads encourages people to share and read literature written by Indigenous authors from Canada. And it's based on the simple truth that through literature and storytelling, we can better understand each other's histories, traditions, cultures, and priorities. Turn that understanding brings us closer together as people and as a society. It unites us, and today we get to understand how Shilawat Klutje ended up with a priority around climate change and really protecting the planet. So we are fortunate to have so many great Indigenous writers from across the country in many disciplines, from nonfiction to graphic novels, poetry, comedy, everything in between. And so if your book club needs suggestions, you can check out hashtag Indigenous Reads, visit the website, check out the local bookstore. And we're finding that more and more bookstores are putting books by Indigenous authors, First Nations, Inuit, Métis in the front of the store now. And as the holidays are fast approaching, our holidays are going to be a little different this year, but as we continue to keep our loved ones and community safe from COVID-19, but we can still come together while apart over the sharing of and love of a good book. And we're finding that so many book clubs are also meeting virtually. So we're encouraging to consider that gifting a book by a First Nations, Inuit, or Métis author this year. There are or ebooks or audio or all of these things that will make things a little bit easier with physical distancing, and it is one of our favorite suggestions that will make not only an introduction to this amazing Indigenous author, but also a pioneer advocate in climate change, and as a respected Inuit leader, writer, educator, nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, winner of so many prizes for her advocacy work, demonstrating the impacts of climate change on human Indigenous rights. So it's internationally recognized, lauded book, The Right to Be Cold. It really does explore the parallels between preserving the Arctic climate, protecting Inuit culture, and how it positively affects the whole planet. And it's never been more important as we try and build back better socially, economically, and environmentally after COVID-19. So I'm honored to be joined by Shilawat Klutje, and look really forward to this conversation. Grinamik Nakamik, Sheila, welcome.
Nakamik, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in this new world order of technology and Zoom, to be talking to you this way.
I firstly need to say that even though it says Sheila on the book, and sometimes it says Sila with two eyes, I also noticed in your book it said that Sila Dunik is the Inuktitut word for wisdom. So were you named about wisdom?
No, actually, in my mother tongue, Inuktitut, there is no SH sound. So Sila, which is a long E, right, is actually Sheila. But everybody just calls me Sila at home. But Sila, what you're talking about, is with one eye.
Ah,
Silatunuk, Sila as the outdoors, environment, consciousness, wisdom, all of those things are all very interconnected. And I often jokingly, half jokingly say perhaps I was destined to do this work as my name is only one letter away from Sila
well,
with
that's
the
what I
one
was
eye.
thinking when I was reading it.
Yeah.
I think, well, it's a properly named, and you've said that if we can't save the frozen Arctic, how can we hope to save the world? And that is, help me pronounce it, Sila Tunik.
Yes, Silatunuk. That's
No.
wisdom.
Oh,
Yes.
that's good.
That's the
Uh,
hallmark of the teaching of Inuit culture.
there's a part in your book where you explain how you got here to this international renown from your community. I wanted to share with you that when I read part about the community ice lockers or the community freezers, that I remember. Why I think we first met. Probably I was a member of the Arctic Caucus that had been formed in 1998, and I think in '99, in '98 we went to Baffin, and then in '99 we were in the Western Arctic in Tuktoyaktuk, and we climbed down into the into the frozen locker, and there was water sort of dripping off the sides of the ice down in the locker, and I thought, well, how, and the elders sort of said that, like, how could anybody debate that climate change was happening? And anyway, I remember just thinking that when it's right before your eyes, which, as I think, as Inuit, you could just see the changes. So that plus your fight about pops, maybe would you mind reading
Yeah.
us a little bit from your book, and then we can chat?
Yeah, sure. And I just wanted to say that, that's almost 20 years ago that we've been signaling changes are happening. So would you like me to read this piece here
I,
to start us off?
absolutely, that'd be great.
Okay. Okay. People often ask me how I got to where I am, how I managed from such humble beginnings to reach a point of global recognition, honorary degrees, and international awards. Of course, the work I did and continue to do, and the deep sense of responsibility I feel toward my Inuit community as an elected official and as a mother, grandmother, friend, and neighbor drove me forward. But there's always been a deeply personal component to all of this. And during the Arnait Nipingit Women's Leadership Summit, which was held in 2010, I was asked what leadership means to me. And leadership, I told the group, means never losing sight of the fact that the issues at hand are so much bigger than you. Leadership is about working from a principled and ethical place within oneself, and it is to model authentically for others a sense of calm, a sense of clarity and focus. And leadership is to always check inward to ensure you're leading from a position of strength, not fear or victimhood, so you do not project your own limitations to those you are modeling possibilities for. And that checking inward and the personal growth that accompanies such introspection have been, I believe, instrumental to my own ability to succeed. And many of the points of recognition, the accomplishments, and the progress in my career came at moments in my life when I had worked through personal issues and discovered some truth that allowed me to stick to my convictions and commitment, to focus on the goal and not the obstacles. And each time I decided to stay the course, Providence seemed to take over. As the saying goes, when a decision is made, the universe conspires to make it happen. And I believe that all of us have what it takes to move toward healing, work through our issues and woundings, rewrite those histories, and change our perspectives. And that kind of inner work gets reflected in the outside world. And for me, the accolades and awards I received are really about my inner mirroring. I like to think of our hardships, our baggage, our woundings as holes in our souls. And I believe that if we don't close those holes, we pass them down in some fashion to our children. And in this way, the historical traumas of our Inuit elders have been passed down to the younger generation. But I also believe that the many tests we face in life often arrive to help us mend those gaps in our souls. So that's part of the reading.
It's so so in your story, um, what would have been some of the first times where you knew you had to lead?
Well, I was always of my own conviction, my own limiting of myself in the early years. Would always say I would never enter into the arena of politics. I mean, I grew up in a family of people, of leaders, as you know. My own brother and Charlie, who was a senator for 34 years, but before that, he was president of our organization here, and he still remains that now. My uncle was mayor, and my mother was a very strong force in my life. But I never was compelled to go in that way. And I write in the book, of course, I'm more of an introvert doing extrovert work. And so it was never something that I felt I could do really well by being in such a public light in that way. And so so I always say that it wasn't that I was looking for it in terms of those leadership roles. It found me, so to speak, and I got elected at the regional level at Makivik Corporation, and then moved on to the ICC Canada and was elected in Alaska at one of our assemblies. Because I was outspoken about education, about our environment, and so on. So people thought, well, maybe you should be leading the Canadian branch at this time. So I ended up with two mandates the first time, very unexpectedly, really. I didn't plan it, and I did not expect to have that second international mandate when I went to Alaska as a delegate for my region of Nunavik. And so I always say, never say never about things, because that's not always the universe's plan for you, and that you have to allow your life to unfold as it may. And it was very much like that for me. And when I got into ICC Canada that year, we were starting the global negotiations on the POPs Treaty, the persistent organic pollutants that were ending up poisoning our food chain and the nursing milk of our mothers in the Arctic, where we became the net recipients of these toxins from far away, from sourced from industry and the byproduct of industry and pesticides. And so as a mother and a soon to be grandmother, young grandmother in those days, for me, it was a no-brainer. It was not just a chemical story that we were working on at the UN level. It was a matter of health, first and foremost, for our people, because it was about our country food. It was about our health. And so changing that from a chemical story to one of health, first and foremost, was absolutely priority for me as a mother. And so that brought me into that, propelled me out there into the global world very quickly overnight. And then it moved on into climate change issues, where those two issues of the toxins in our food chain and climate change are both very paralleled. They're both about health and cultural survival of our people. So that's how it all began. And of course, pioneering the work on linking climate change to human rights was once again one of those moments of course, that's what this is about, our health, our culture, our ability to, our rights to educate our children, our right to safety, security, all of those things that are entrenched already in international law is really about that. It's our right to be Inuit as we know it in the best of ways, that was being minimized and destroyed by the CO2s in our atmosphere. So again, ran with that. And that's how all that began. But it's about humanizing these issues that often get, defined as something outside of the community. And so that's been my campaign since, even beyond elected politics, since I left elected politics in 2005, and that's what going on now. Almost a couple of decades already, where I'm 15 years ago. I'm still at it because for me, it's my life's. I find it's my life's mission to continue on this work, on this path.
is it in terms of, I mean, even the right to be cold in the name of your book? I just think it's one of the most brilliant explanations about the right to an Inuit way of life, and the fact that you were sounding the alarm that both the pops, the pollutants were concentrating there, and the planet was melting faster there. That you were the one that ringing the bell saying we've got to do something. And did you find in those early international meetings that it was Inuit around the top of the world that were able to bear witness to the change was happening and it wasn't good?
That's right. I mean, as Inuit, our culture is based on the ice, the snow, and the cold. We don't just survive in it; we thrive in that, including all of our wildlife. And so, of course, it was a matter of survival. And for us, the ice and snow represent transportation and mobility. And when that starts to go, it's an issue of safety and security first and foremost, as we travel on those icy highways to our what I call our supermarket out there in the environment to provide for the families the highly nutritious food that we harvest and hunt. And so for us, it really is about the community at the community level, what is being impacted. And so, of course, you had to really put not just put the human face to the issue, but put a human rights issue to it. And it continues to be that way, where people are starting to. It took a while. It took me maybe 5 years for it to become mainstream language, climate change and human rights. But in the beginning, even those that are working in those arenas didn't quite make that connection at first, including Amnesty International. But because people are used to the idea that it's individuals being violated in some way, but not collective peoples being violated in some way. And so I think we help to change the discourse and the language on these issues of what does human rights mean when it comes to environmental degradation and climate change.
And in terms of really the right not to be poisoned, which is what the fight around POPs was, I think. As a young girl, I think I had a copy of The Silent Spring on my bedside table, and Rachel Carson, and you won the prize in her honor. I mean, she started this in 1962, I think, and then died 2 years later. But when did that POPs and that whole the poisoning really of your universe, your space, when did that come to your attention, or when did you know you had to do something about it?
Yeah, well, we have known since the 80s when the testing started to come through, where these persistent organic pollutants were being found in studies that were being done in southern Canada, what we call southern Canada, and these researchers and scientists said, well, let's do some testing in the Arctic to assess, and to make some comparisons, because Arctic is pristine after all. So that's when they discovered, oh my gosh, it's even in higher density in the Arctic, these POPs, where they've accumulated, in the Arctic sink and ended up in the marine mammals that we eat, because they make their home in the fatty tissues of our marine mammals that we eat and ingest. So when all of that started to come out, the alarm was, it was just, we were so alarmed and totally frustrated by the fact that we were being poisoned from afar, and our food chain was, and when the raw data came out of those studies, all the scientists realized that we have a global problem here. These toxins are making their way up through the weather patterns into the food chain of Inuit, and ending up in high concentrations in their bodies and in the nursing milk of their mothers. And so when we found this out in the 80s, many people were there before me. I wasn't around I was raising my babies at the time, so I wasn't involved in politics by any means in the 80s. And they ended up getting very mobilized. There were people in the community and ITK and many others working with Health Canada in trying to find ways in which this kind of messaging could be given to the community so that choices can be made. Where if you're expecting, if you're expecting that you are to have less muck duck or the seal fat and the whale fat, that kind of thing was going on. But when I came into the picture, when I was elected in 1995, the global negotiations, it took 10 years to prepare the stage for that, but the UN global negotiations were starting when just after I was elected. And so I came into the play just at that time. And a coalition was created between Inuit, the Dene, the Gwich'in, the Athabaskan, the Russian indigenous people, where we all created a coalition. I became the spokesperson for that coalition and attended every one of those global negotiations in 5 different countries, ending in the signing of the Stockholm Convention in Sweden, in Stockholm. And we worked really closely together in those years with the federal government. And I, it was David Anderson was the environment minister at the time. And he ratified and signed right away that accord, that convention in Stockholm, which was a very proud moment. But we struggled in the beginning to develop that teamwork, but at the end of the day, we really did show that government and Indigenous peoples can sing from the same song sheet and really move mountains. And it was one of the first in those days. I don't know what it's like now, but it was in those days. It was one of the first UN treaties to have been signed, ratified, and enforced in a very short period of time. So we're very proud of that work that Inuit influenced. And in those days, we worked very closely together with the Canadian government on those issues.
I remember when I was elected in 97, I guess, that Karen Kraft Sloan and the member of parliament for York Simcoe and David Anderson. I mean, I just remember being so impressed with
Clifford Lincoln,
how much they knew. And again, this partnership with the Indigenous peoples of the North. Really, I don't think I knew what POPs were until that they had a caucus meeting or were trying to teach us really. And it was alarming, I think, as members of parliament to find out that, I think it's always shocking when you find out something you didn't even know anything about. And
right.
Since maybe reading Silent Spring a long time before, you sort of think things are getting better. And so it was the Stockholm Convention and the hard work that led up to that really started to change things. Do you think that it has made your country food safer? And I mean, do you think, how have we been doing since then?
Yeah. I don't follow up a lot on the research currently, but I do know that people do know and have informed me that yes, it certainly has over the years made our country food safer by not just managing these toxins, but really eliminating them at their source. And at the time, there were 12 that we call them the dirty dozen that we were able to eliminate and have enough countries ratify to eliminate them. And it has made our country food safer. There's no doubt, but there's always these new toxins coming into the play as well that we can't be constantly, we can't be complacent about these issues because we're in a world that's very interrelated and interconnected. And of course, we know about, what we're going through right now with the virus and the pandemic is that everything is interconnected. And certainly that was the case with the POPs issues. But yes, we are in a safer place with many of our marine mammals as a result of that work. But again, it's not to be complacent and it's not to put it in the back burner because there are other toxins that come into play. And, our polar bears show that there is other certain toxins that are in their bloodstream as well, with from flame retardants, for example, from children's pajamas and couches and so on, that we tend to put for safety, but at the end of the day, it's not really safe for everybody in the world. So we've got to think about how we develop and make things as well, that end up harming others far from the source of their production.
In this now real urgent fight against climate change, or mitigating, but also fighting against, and I think that there seems to be a increasing understanding about how Indigenous knowledge merged with the science is sort of two and two makes five. How when you work together, just as you described, that we can get much better results faster if we listen to the people who've been observing for a long time and can point out the significant changes. Is in listening to the elders and being able to put Arctic Inuit perspectives that you that was in 2009 at the LaFontaine Baldwin lecture. You talked about returning Canada to a path of principle and Arctic and Inuit perspective. Tell us what that would look like if Canada really was leading on this. I know I was worried at the Arctic Circle meeting a number of years ago that the Arctic was sort of being described as a common good, and a lot of the southern countries, obviously China has talked about a near Arctic or perspective, Japan. How do we make sure that the Inuit and Arctic perspective is driving public policy with respect to the North?
I mean, we have organizations that represent our people at the national and international level, and I think the experience that we had with the success of the POPs Treaty, the Stockholm Convention, is a model that could be replicated on so many levels, so many fronts. That we are not a people that just want to go and complain at these meetings or these conventions, but we have much to offer in terms of the wisdom and the understanding of what sustainability looks like. And so, I've often said, and I continue to say in all of the talks that I give, and particularly now in the setting that we're in, where we've been brought to our knees because we have been, supporting such unsustainable activities for way too long and not listening to the voices of the Indigenous peoples and Inuit of the world who live and depend upon a healthy environment for their livelihoods, and to even to teach their children about how to be model citizens and how to be strong children. All of those things that were taken away with institutional learning and never replicated elsewhere is what is lacking in our younger generation in knowing what needs to get done to have a strong and vibrant life that is filled with coping skills and resiliency and all of the things that I talk about, the strength of Inuit culture, which is all Indigenous culture is that way. And so you may think, oh, that's kind of a simplistic way of looking at things, but really it's about that. We have lost that connection to nature. And, often people say now, and I say this, it's nature deficit disorder that is causing all of this disconnect that we're going through. And if we could just have nature teach us back the real values and principles of life, such as Indigenous peoples do, then we have an opportunity to learn and not just see us as victims of all of these things, because that's what most people see is that, high suicide rates and the violence and the addictions and all of those things. But yet, if you looked deeply with a great deal of respect rather than othering us, you would see that we understand the cycles of nature and the cycles of life in incredibly deep ways where the world needs to understand those pieces, because it's because of that disconnect that urban settings have had with each other, with their environment, and with their food source, that we're even debating any of these issues of climate change and environmental degradation. So it's to bring all of that back and heed and listen, because the very thing I think that the world is seeking is right under their noses, and it is Indigenous wisdom. Indigenous wisdom is the medicine the world seeks to develop a good, sustainable world and planet and address these issues from a very human perspective.
That's so beautiful. But the indigenous wisdom is the medicine the world seeks. And no, and I think that COVID-19 has given us more time to think, and more time to think about these existential threats like climate change, but also somehow looking after one another as Indigenous people have protected their elders, or the kind of respect that there is for the land and the water and the ice. And no, I think that there's an opening now for
Yes.
particularly Canadians in the true North, strong and free, to understand that this is our country. I always say when I go into the grade 9 classrooms, when they look at a map of Canada, realize that Baker Lake is the center of our country, and yet no one really has the opportunities yet to get to the north. And it changed my life in understanding who I was as a Canadian, I think, in terms of the dignity and resilience of the people, the majesty of the land and the water and the ice. It is so important, and medicine, I think,
Yeah.
for and a goal really is the sort of inukshuk for our country to find a way forward.
It's right. And this pandemic, has, brought many of us to a halt. My whole livelihood really came to a halt in March, because I rely on public events to get out there and speak to audiences across our country and beyond. But more than that, I think it has allowed us to reflect, but it also has really brought to light, even in much more clear terms, the actual weaknesses in the systems, especially for Indigenous people and the vulnerable. And so it's one of those moments where it is the vulnerable that are now going to be very impacted, and have been already. The Black Lives Matter that rose from that as well, and the Navajo in the U.S. And of course, now our communities are starting to have more and more cases showing up the weaknesses in our health systems, and in all of the systems. It's not just about climate change anymore. It's really about looking at all of our governance systems and all of the programs that haven't been working well for the vulnerable. And it's an eye opener at this time, and it's an opportunity, though, to try to change the way in which we do business and in the way in which we do governance, and looking at these issues and paying attention to, again, not victimizing us, but to show, the strength of people, that when we come together, we can work together in very strong ways, by coming together and realizing that we're in this together. We're a common humanity here. It isn't us and them and othering one another anymore. This is really an opportunity to allow for all of us to come together and do it right.
No, I think, yeah, you're so right. And do you have, in terms of Indigenous wisdom being the medicine, what for Canadians that would like to know more, for that thirst that I think there is to fill in the gaps of what we never learned in school, for us to understand this huge part of Canada that sparsely populated, with such important knowledge and lessons. Is, what would be the kinds of things that as we keep calm and hibernate this winter, what would maybe at least in the cities, I think Inuit will be out and about as they always have been. But um, what what would be some of the things that you would prescribe as medicine? And are there things that you think Canadians should read, that book clubs or the kinds of things that would be important in furthering our understanding? And as you say, it's almost like making new friends instead of othering. What are the kinds of things that you think could help bring people together?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is exactly what we're doing now is one of them. And looking at all, I don't know if these are all Indigenous books that are stacked up beside you or behind you,
Yeah,
but it's to read them, read these books from Indigenous authors. But it's also about not just reading them, but it's getting them into our high schools and into our universities. And that, it's not happening enough. It's not happening enough, and that's got to happen if our younger generation learn early. I taught at two universities in the last 10 years or so, a year at Bowdoin College in Maine and then at Mount Allison University. And each class, the two classes that I taught on the human dimension to climate change, had not been taught any of this history in high school, elementary, high school, or university. And some of them were fourth year university students. And so it's quite the eye opening experience for them to hear, not just from firsthand, Indigenous people, such as myself coming down from the North and teaching at these universities, but also even the films that have been produced by Indigenous, younger generation that are now very, very eye opening. If you haven't seen The Angry Inuk by Alethea from Iqaluit, please do so.
yes,
And the Grizzlies by
yeah.
again by Stacy and others from Iqaluit. Well, she's from Khuluto. Look at those kinds of films, look at the documentaries, and look at the history, because even NFS has National Film Board of Canada, I should say, has some remarkable films that they did way back about the transition that was happening and I would show those in class. And it was just an eye opener for them. And in fact, they were quite upset by the fact that they had never been taught any of this in high school or in their university classes, that much of it is theoretical. So to put the human face and the human spirit into those school programs by first, of course, reading, making sure that students are all reading these books, but having Indigenous elders and others come in and teach some of those classes is just huge. It's a game changer. It really is. So those would be some of the ways in which change can happen.
And I don't think people understand that those National Film Board films are all free online. And I used to, when I was allowed to be on a plane, I used to go to that. There used to be a Canadian film place where you could go to the NFB site and you could, on a flight, be able to see some of those amazing films. I did see Grizzlies early on, and then when we went to Kuglutu for the Inuit National Inuit Day, or Nunavut Day, I think, the amazing young woman who was the organizer of the team, she's now a counselor there, and it is also inspiring. And then there's the sad bits, the movie that about the TB in Quebec, and
Yeah.
where the
Yeah.
ship came in and people went out to get their chest x-rays, and then sometimes their families never saw them again.
Right.
Heartbreaking stories that
Yeah.
we didn't learn
That's
about
right.
that in school.
Yeah, those historical traumas, are that's why I wrote the book for a number of reasons, but one of them was to try to put into context those historical traumas, yeah, are the reason why we struggle so much in our communities. You know, and so it's important for people and a younger generation and beyond to understand those historical traumas and put into context, because often people will make up things in their own minds about how come these people are so, troubled, and what's going on there, and why can't they just get on board and assimilate, and why can't they just get over their issues. They don't realize the deep traumas of the past and how that is now reflecting in what is happening in our communities with our younger generation, who carry that burden on their shoulders without fully understanding. So, writing the book, I wanted our younger generation to understand that context so that they don't carry so much of that burden from a very personal way, and to alleviate some of that load they carry by understanding, that it's not personal, even though it can feel that way. And of course, it can be very personal when you've got conflict and abuse within your own family structures. But at the same time, to understand why it's happening is a very important piece in moving beyond and healing. And so that was, of course, one of the main reasons I wrote that. But also because the world and the outside world has to understand that context, and do the right things in terms of respecting that history, and being there with us, not to save us, because that mission to save us is the crux of is actually the root of the problems that we face, but to understand it and to honor those pieces and that history in a way that allows for them to start to shift their own attitudes towards Indigenous peoples.
I
And
think,
so those were the main reasons.
yeah, and I know when we were in Ottawa, I mean, hearing some of the names of these places, because unfortunately, because of COVID, that whether it's Ottawa or whether it's Anakilowac, to for Canadians to understand what had happened in those communities where people were relocated from where they'd always been, because for the convenience of the government, and I think the killing of the sled dogs and some of the just horrific ways that
Yeah.
the government of Canada tried to control a way of life, and moving from the south to the north of Santa Kilowak and killing the dogs so they couldn't go home. And I think that when we look at racism and now, that there are, as you were mentioning, Black Lives Matter, there were two state-sanctioned racisms. One is colonization and the settlers thinking they knew better, and the other being slavery, and both state sanctions. That was the law. Just in terms of the right to be cold, I just wanted to. I don't think I've told you the story of being at the Franklin exhibit in the British Marine Museum, and there was a little sort of kiosk that was the voice of an elder who remembered his, would it be grandfather or great grandfather, Franklin expedition, and it 3 times he said, and their hats weren't attached to their coats, and it was, he then said it 3 times, their hats weren't attached to their coats, meaning that the Southerners just knew nothing about how to stay warm, or how to, as you say, thrive in the ice and the snow. And I remember thinking that why would they think that the Southerners knew anything to be able to tell them how to live, or how to educate their children, or stay safe. Anyway, I think about that often when I think of colonization, and how wrong that European culture was when they came to try and replace the beauty and the dignity of the people who were here first.
Yeah, absolutely. And that history is very, it's very stark in those terms where these explorers died at their peril as a result of not listening to the wisdom of Inuit. But, we have to also put into the current perspective that structural racism still continues on in our homelands, because otherwise you would see a real shift and change happening at the social and health level, but it's not. The indicators are still there and very strong. And so, I think we have to continue to look at how our own governance systems, our own organizations are part of the problem still, and that structural racism is definitely alive and well. And how we have to approach things differently, and to give that respect to Indigenous peoples, and to give the opportunity for people to grow into those organizations and do it. But it's this lack of confidence in Indigenous peoples, as though we weren't able to manage our own organizations, which is really far, very far from the truth. There are many who can, but we just haven't been doing it right. And so we have to keep at it, and we have to keep ensuring that things are going to shift and change within our own institutions for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you say, there's the right to be called, but there's the right to be heard, but the right to self determination, and making sure that 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 we do move from this sort of paternalism to a true partnership that respects rights
Mhm.
and feels like a partnership to First
Yeah.
Nation.
Yes. And take the risk, as governments have to also take the risk, that what kind of terrible thing is going to happen if we become self-determined people. It's like the unknown. Somehow it's what losing control, is not necessarily a bad thing at all. I have been working with foundations for 3 years now on re-engineering how philanthropy is worked through in terms of funds, that are brought out, given to Indigenous projects and priorities. And there are people who are willing to give up that control, but it's a tough thing to do. But it's such a relieving process. I mean, it's a very difficult process to go through, but at the same time, it's that's what decolonizing is all about. That is trying to do things very differently, and re-engineering these processes that allows for people to really come to that place where they feel safe and say, yeah, let's let go. Let's let go of this control we've had over Indigenous peoples and see where it goes. It takes a lot, and it really happens at the speed of trust. There's no doubt about that. It's a very slow process. And we've learned that through this work that I'm, involved in with the foundations, is that, yeah, indeed, it's slow. And it, again, as I say, it goes at the speed of trust, but it has to happen that way. It has to happen. The letting go of that control, and trusting that Indigenous peoples can really manage their own affairs in really profound and healthy ways, is something that we have to continue to convince, whether it's our own institutions, or our governance systems and our government.
So we often talk about creating the space for that, and it really is letting go and getting out of the way so that self determination takes place. But I also think that you've been so important in saying we also better listen and on the areas where Indigenous knowledge and wisdom can help us get back on a good path, we need to really get out of the way and let them lead. And I think that is, I think that's why your book is so important, and why you're a national treasure, in terms of your leadership for Canada. I just think that this is, you know, I hope that through Zoom and through all of these kinds of things, that all Canadians feel that they're making new friends that they can learn from. And I just can't thank you enough for doing this. And I hope that, that everybody will pick, yeah, this will be under everybody's Christmas tree or a Hanukkah bush or whatever, it almost should be compulsory rating, I think, for all Canadians. And we will do whatever we can to prescribe it. As a doctor, I learned how to not to prescribe sometimes, but I think I could prescribe this book as we go forward with this shared responsibility to protect the planet and to listen to people like you who know. So I can't thank you enough for doing this. And is there any last minute prescription books or anything that you think, or maybe just this one?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the timing of this is quite nice to end on. But tomorrow night, I wasn't just, the first 2 months I was in shock in the pandemic, wondering, okay, what am I going to do with my life if I'm not able to travel? But during this period of time, I wrote a very long piece, and a great piece, I think, if I may say so myself, for the Granda magazine from the UK for their Nature edition. And this will be launched tomorrow night. And so be on the lookout for this piece that I wrote during the pandemic called Upengasak, Arctic Spring. And it's to reach out once again to the world as to the remarkable power of Inuit culture and what we are doing to our planet. And the epilogue that I write for it is about my reflections on the connection between climate change and the pandemic. That we often focus only on negating certain countries or certain people for starting this virus, but in reality it's about what we're doing to our planet and the habitat of wildlife, all wildlife, including the bats. So we've got to think broader and bigger and larger and deeper about all of these connections, and so that's the piece that will be out tomorrow night. So Granda magazine, an influential magazine apparently from the UK, and that gets launched tomorrow night.
Excellent. Well, we'll put the link for that up, and we can let people know how to find it. And we look forward to an Arctic spring here in Canada with our vaccines,
Yeah.
and hopefully be able to travel again.
Yes.
We want you out and about, but it's, as we are now getting a bit better at being together while apart. I can't thank you enough, Nakumik, and on behalf of all Canadians, for all you've done and continue to do, and all you will do, as we now have, I think, all Canadians with us on this fight against climate change and anything that ruins this tiny planet that we all share. So
Yes. Thank you.
You are amazing.
Thank you, Nakumik. Thank you very much, Minister, for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakumik.
Nakumik.